Hugo Rafael Chávez Frías was a Venezuelan politician and military officer who served as the 52nd president of Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013, except for a brief period of 47 hours in 2002. Chávez was also leader of the Fifth Republic Movement political party from its foundation in 1997 until 2007, when it merged with several other parties to form the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, which he led until 2012. Born into a middle-class family in Sabaneta, Barinas, Chávez became a career military officer. After becoming dissatisfied with the Venezuelan political system based on the Punto Fijo Pact, he founded the clandestine revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200, MBR 200, in the early 1980s. Chávez led the MBR 200 in its unsuccessful coup d'état against the Democratic Action government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992, for which he was imprisoned. Pardoned from prison 2 years later, he founded the Fifth Republic Movement political party, and then receiving 56.2% of the vote, was elected president of Venezuela in 1998. He was re-elected in the 2000 Venezuelan general election with 59.8% of the vote and again in the 2006 Venezuelan presidential election, with 62.8% of the vote. After winning his fourth term as president in the 2012 Venezuelan presidential election with 55.1% of the vote, he was to be sworn in on January 10, 2013. However, the inauguration was cancelled due to his cancer treatment, and on March 5 at age 58, he died in Caracas. Following the adoption of the 1999 Venezuelan constitution, Chávez focused on enacting social reforms as part of the Bolivarian Revolution. Using record-high oil revenues of the 2000s, his government nationalized key industries, created participatory democratic communal councils and implemented social programs known as the Bolivarian missions to expand access to food, housing, healthcare, and education. While these initiatives led to temporary improvements in poverty reduction and social welfare during periods of high oil revenue, their reliance on state control and centralized planning exposed significant structural weaknesses as oil prices declined. The high oil profits coinciding with the start of Chávez's presidency resulted in temporary improvements in areas such as poverty, literacy, income equality, and quality of life between primarily 2003 and 2007, though extensive changes in structural inequalities did not occur. On June 2, 2010, Chávez declared an economic war on Venezuela's upper classes due to shortages, arguably beginning the crisis in Venezuela. By the end of Chávez's presidency in the early 2010s, economic actions performed by his government during the preceding decade, such as deficit spending and price controls, proved to be unsustainable, with Venezuela's economy faltering. At the same time, poverty, inflation, and shortages increased. Under Chávez, Venezuela experienced democratic backsliding, as he suppressed the press, manipulated electoral laws, and arrested and exiled government critics. His use of enabling acts and his government's use of propaganda were controversial. Chávez's presidency saw significant increases in the country's murder rate and continued corruption within the police force and the government. Across the political spectrum, Chávez is regarded as one of the most influential and controversial politicians in the modern history of Venezuela and Latin America. His 14-year presidency marked the start of the socialist pink tide sweeping Latin America. He supported Latin American and Caribbean cooperation and was instrumental in setting up the Pan-Regional Union of South American Nations, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, the Bank of the South and the regional television network Telesur. Internationally, Chávez aligned himself with the Marxist, Leninist governments of Fidel and then Raúl Castro in Cuba, as well as the socialist governments of Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. Chávez's ideas, programs, and style form the basis of chavismo, a political ideology closely associated with Bolivarianism and socialism of the 21st century. Chávez described his policies as anti-imperialist, being a prominent adversary of the United States' foreign policy as well as a vocal critic of neoliberalism and laissez-faire capitalism. He described himself as a Marxist. Chávez was born on July 28, 1954 in his paternal grandmother Rosa Inés Chávez's home, a modest three-room house located in the rural village Sabaneta, Barinas state. The Chávez family were of Amerindian, Afro-Venezuelan, Spanish and Italian descent. His parents, Hugo de los Reyes Chávez, described as a proud COPI member, and Elena Frias de Chávez, were school teachers who lived in the small village of Los Rastrojos. Hugo was born the second of 7 children. Chávez's childhood of supposed poverty has been disputed, as he possibly changed the story of his background for political reasons. Attending the Julian Pino Elementary School, Chávez was particularly interested in the 19th-century Federalist General Ezequiel Zamora, in whose army his own great-great-grandfather had served. With no high school in their area, Hugo's parents sent Hugo and his older brother Adán to live with their grandmother Rosa, who lived in a lower-middle-class subsidized home provided by the government, where they attended Daniel O'Leary High School in the mid-1960s. His father, despite having the salary of a teacher, helped pay for college for Chávez and his siblings. Aged 17, Chávez studied at the Venezuelan Academy of Military Sciences in Caracas, following a curriculum known as the Andrés Bello Plan, instituted by a group of progressive, nationalistic military officers. This new curriculum encouraged students to learn not only military routines and tactics but also a wide variety of other topics, and to do so civilian professors were brought in from other universities to give lectures to the military cadets. Living in Caracas, he began to get involved in activities outside of the military school, playing baseball and softball with the Criollitos de Venezuela team, progressing with them to the Venezuelan National Baseball Championships. He also wrote poetry, fiction, and drama, and painted. He also became interested in the Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara, 1928–1967, after reading his memoir The Diary of Che Guevara. In 1974, he was selected to be a representative in the commemorations for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Ayacucho in Peru, the conflict in which Simón Bolívar's lieutenant, Antonio José de Sucre, defeated royalist forces during the Peruvian War of Independence. In Peru, Chávez heard the leftist president, General Juan Velasco Alvarado, 1910–1977, speak, and inspired by Velasco's ideas that the military should act in the interests of the working classes when the ruling classes were perceived as corrupt. Befriending the son of Maximum leader Omar Torrijos, the leftist dictator of Panama, Chávez visited Panama, where he met with Torrijos, and was impressed with his land reform program that was designed to benefit the peasants. Influenced by Torrijos and Velasco, he saw the potential for military generals to seize control of a government when the civilian authorities were perceived as serving the interests of only the wealthy elites. Chávez later said, "With Torrijos, I became a Torrijista. With Velasco the first became a Velasquist. And with Pinochet, I became an anti-Pinochetist." In 1975, Chávez graduated from the military academy as one of the top graduates of the year. Following his graduation, Chávez was stationed as a communications officer at a counterinsurgency unit in Barinas. In 1977, Chávez's unit was transferred to Anzoátegui, where they were involved in battling the Red Flag Party, a Marxist, Marxist insurgency group. After intervening to prevent the beating of an alleged insurgent by other soldiers, Chávez began to have his doubts about the army. In 1977, he founded a revolutionary movement within the armed forces, in the hope that he could one day introduce a leftist government to Venezuela. The Venezuelan People's Liberation Army, Ejército de Liberación del Pueblo de Venezuela, or ELPV, consisted of him and a handful of his fellow soldiers who had no immediate plans for direct action, though they knew they wanted a middle way between the right-wing policies of the government and the far-left position of the Red Flag. Nevertheless, hoping to gain an alliance with civilian leftist groups in Venezuela, Chávez set up clandestine meetings with various prominent Marxists, including Alfredo Maniero, the founder of the Radical Cause, and Douglas Bravo. 5 years after his creation of the ELPV, Chávez went on to form a new secretive cell within the military, the Bolivarian Revolutionary Army 200, EBR 200, later redesignated the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200, MBR 200. He was inspired by Simón Bolívar, Simón Rodríguez, and Ezequiel Zamora, who became known as the three roots of the tree of the MBR 200. In 1984 he met Herma Marxman, a recently divorced history teacher with whom he had an affair that lasted several years. During this time Francisco Arias Cardenas, a soldier interested in liberation theology, also joined MBR 200. After some time, some senior military officers became suspicious of Chávez and reassigned him so that he would not be able to gain any more fresh new recruits from the academy. He was sent to take command of the remote barracks at Elorza in Apure state. In 1989, Carlos Andrés Pérez was elected president, and though he had promised to oppose the International Monetary Fund's policies, once he got into office he enacted economic policies supported by the IMF, angering the public. In an attempt to stop widespread lootings and protests that followed his spending cuts, known as El Caracazo, Pérez initiated Plan Ávila, a military contingency plan by the Venezuelan army to maintain public order, and an outbreak of violent repression unfolded. Though members of Chávez's MBR 200 movement allegedly participated in the crackdown, Chávez did not, since he was then hospitalized with chicken pox. He later condemned the event as genocide. Chávez began preparing for a military coup d'état known as Operation Zamora. The plan involved members of the military overwhelming military locations and communication installations and then establishing Rafael Caldera in power once Pérez was captured and assassinated. Chávez delayed the MBR 200 coup, initially planned for December, until the early twilight hours of February 4, 1992. On that date 5 army units under Chávez's command moved into urban Caracas. Despite years of planning, the coup quickly encountered trouble since Chávez commanded the loyalty of less than 10% of Venezuela's military. After numerous betrayals, defections, errors, and other unforeseen circumstances, Chávez and a small group of rebels found themselves hiding in the military museum, unable to communicate with other members of their team. Pérez managed to escape Miraflores Palace. Officially, 32 civilians, police officers and soldiers were killed and 50 soldiers and some 80 civilians injured during the ensuing violence. Chávez gave himself up to the government and appeared on television, in uniform, to call on the remaining coup members to lay down their arms. Chávez remarked in his speech that they had failed only por ahora, for now. Venezuelans, particularly poor ones, began seeing him as someone who stood up against government corruption and kleptocracy. The coup flopped militarily and dozens died but made him a media star, noted Rory Carroll of The Guardian. Chávez was arrested and imprisoned at the San Carlos military stockade, racked with guilt and feeling responsible for the failure of the coup. Pro-Chávez demonstrations outside San Carlos led to his transfer to Yair prison. Another unsuccessful coup against the government occurred in November, with the fighting during the coups resulting in the deaths of at least 143 people and perhaps as many as several hundred. Pérez was impeached a year later, charged with malfeasance and misappropriating funds. While Chávez and the other senior members of the MBR 200 were in prison, his relationship with Herma Marxman broke up in July 1993. In 1994, Rafael Caldera, 1916 to 2009, of the centrist National Convergence Party who allegedly had knowledge of the coup was elected president and soon afterward he freed Chávez and the other imprisoned MBR 200 members, though Caldera banned them from returning to the military. After his release, on December 14, 1994, Chávez visited Cuba during the special period, where he was received by Fidel Castro with head of state honors. During his visit, Chávez gave a speech at the Aula Magna of the University of Havana before Fidel and the Cuban high hierarchy where, among other things, he said, "We have a long-term strategic project, in which the Cubans have and would have much to contribute, and it is a project of a 20 to 40 year horizon, a sovereign economic model. Traveling around Latin America in search of foreign support for his Bolivarian movement, he visited Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, and Cuba, where he met Castro and became friends with him. According to journalist Patricia Polio, during his stay in Colombia, he spent 6 months receiving guerrilla training and establishing contacts with the FARC and ELN terrorist groups, and even adopted a nom de guerre Comandante Centeno. By now Chávez was a supporter of taking military action, believing that the oligarchy would never allow him and his supporters to win an election. Chávez and his supporters later founded a political party, the Fifth Republic Movement, MVR, Movimiento Quinta República, in July 1997 in order to support Chávez's candidacy in the 1998 presidential election. Chávez went on a tour around the country. On his tours, he met Marisabel Rodriguez, who would give birth to their daughter shortly before becoming his second wife in 1997. At the start of the election run-up, front-runner Irene Saez was backed by one of Venezuela's two primary political parties, COPI. Chávez's revolutionary rhetoric gained him support from Patria para Todos, Homeland for All, the Partido Comunista Venezolano, Venezuelan Communist Party, and the Movimiento al Socialismo, Movement for Socialism. Chávez received support from different sectors. The lower class felt identified with Chávez, that he cared about their needs and would offer a solution to their problems. Part of the middle class also supported, feeling frustrated with corruption and wishing for a strong-handed government. Chávez also received support from members of the old left, as well as the members of the militarist right wing, some of them nostalgic for the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez. By May 1998, Chávez's support had risen to 30% in polls, and by August he was registering 39%. Voter turnout was 63%, and Chávez won the election with 56.2% of the vote. Chávez's presidential inauguration took place February 2, 1999. He deviated from the usual words of the presidential oath when he took it, proclaiming, "I swear before God and my people that upon this moribund constitution I will drive forth the necessary democratic transformations so that the new republic will have a Magna Carta befitting these new times." Freedom in Venezuela suffered following the decision of President Hugo Chávez, ratified in a national referendum, to abolish Congress and the judiciary, and by his creation of a parallel government of military cronies. Soon after being established into office, Chávez spent much of his time attempting to abolish existing checks and balances in Venezuela. He appointed new figures to government posts, adding leftist allies to key positions, and army colleagues were given a far bigger say in the day-to-day running of the country. For instance, he put Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200 founder Jesus Urdaneta ES in charge of the National Directorate of Intelligence and Prevention Services and made Hernan Gruber Adraman ES, one of the 1992 coup leaders, governor of the Federal District of Caracas. His critics referred to these government officials as the Boliburgia or Bolivarian bourgeoisie and highlighted that it included few people with experience in public administration. The number of his immediate family members in Venezuelan politics also led to accusations of nepotism. Chávez appointed businessman Roberto Mandini president of the state-run oil company Petróleos de Venezuela. Chávez initially believed that capitalism was still a valid economic model for Venezuela, but only Rhenish capitalism, not neoliberalism. Low oil prices made Chávez's government reliant on international free markets during his first months in office, when he showed pragmatism and political moderation, and continued to encourage foreign investment in Venezuela. During a visit to the United States in 1999, he rang the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange. His administration held formal talks with the International Monetary Fund until oil prices rose enough to let the government rule out the need for any financial assistance. Beginning February 27, 1999, the 10th anniversary of the Caracazo, Chávez set into motion a social welfare program called Plan Bolívar 2000. He said he had allotted $20.8 million for the plan. The plan involved 70,000 soldiers, sailors, and members of the Air Force repairing roads and hospitals, removing stagnant water that offered breeding areas for disease-carrying mosquitoes, offering free medical care and vaccinations, and selling food at low prices. Several scandals later affected the program as allegations of corruption were formulated against generals involved in the plan and that significant amounts of money had been diverted. Chávez called a public referendum, which he hoped would support his plans to form a constituent assembly of representatives from across Venezuela and from indigenous tribal groups to rewrite the Venezuelan constitution. Chávez said he had to run again. Venezuela's socialist revolution was like an unfinished painting and he was the artist, he said, while someone else could have another vision, start to alter the contours of the painting. There was a low turnout of 37.65% and an abstention of 62.35%, 88% of the voters supported his proposal. Chávez called an election on July 25 to elect the members of the Constituent Assembly. Over 900 of the 1,171 candidates standing for election were Chávez opponents. To elect the members of the Assembly, Chávez used a formula designed by mathematical experts and politicians, known at the time as the Keno lottery, or the keys of Chávez. Chávez obtained 51% of the votes, but his supporters took 95% of the seats, 125 in total, including all of the seats assigned to indigenous groups, while the opposition won 6 seats. On August 12, 1999, the new Constituent Assembly voted to give themselves the power to abolish government institutions and to dismiss officials who were perceived as corrupt or as operating only in their own interests. Opponents of the Chávez regime argued that it was dictatorial. Most jurists believed that the new Constituent Assembly had become the country's supreme authority and that all other institutions were subordinate to it. The Assembly also declared a judicial emergency and granted itself the power to overhaul the judicial system. The Supreme Court ruled that the Assembly did indeed have this authority, and was replaced in the 1999 Constitution with the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. The Constituent Assembly put together a new constitution, which was voted on at a referendum in December 1999. 72% of those who voted approved of the new constitution. There was a low turnout and an abstention vote of over 50%. The new constitution provided protections for the environment and indigenous people, socio-economic guarantees and state benefits, while giving greater powers to the president. The presidential term was extended to 6 years, and a president was allowed to serve for 2 consecutive terms. Previously, a sitting president could not run for re-election for 10 years after leaving office. It also replaced the bicameral Congress with a unicameral legislative assembly and gave the president the power to legislate on citizen rights, to promote military officers and to oversee economic and financial matters. The assembly also gave the military a mandated role in the government by empowering it to ensure public order and aid national development, which the previous constitution had expressly forbidden. In the new constitution, the country, until then officially known as the Republic of Venezuela, was renamed the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, República Bolivariana de Venezuela, at Chávez's request. Chávez's actions following the ratification of the 1999 Venezuelan Constitution government weakened many of Venezuela's checks and balances, allowing the government to control every branch of the Venezuelan government for over 15 years after it passed until the Venezuelan parliamentary election in 2015. In May 2000 he launched his own Sunday morning radio show, Allo Presidente, Hello, President, on the state radio network. This followed an earlier Thursday night television show, De Frente con el Presidente, Face to Face with the President. He founded 2 newspapers, El Correo del Presidente, The President's Post, founded in July, for which he acted as editor-in-chief, and Vea, C, another newspaper, as well as Question Magazine and Vive TV. El Correo was later shut down among accusations of corruption and mismanagement. In his television and radio shows, he answered calls from citizens, discussed his latest policies, sang songs, and told jokes. In June 2000 he separated from his wife Marisabel, and their divorce was finalized in January 2004. Under the new constitution, it was legally required that new elections be held in order to re-legitimize the government and president. This presidential election in July 2000 would be a part of a greater mega-election, the first time in the country's history that the president, governors, national and regional congressmen, mayors, and councilmen would be voted for on the same day. Going into the elections, Chávez had control of all three branches of government. For the position of president, Chávez's closest challenger proved to be his former friend and co-conspirator in the 1992 coup, Francisco Arias Cardenas, who since becoming a governor of Zulia state had turned towards the political center and begun to denounce Chávez as autocratic. Some of his supporters feared that he had alienated those in the middle class and the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy who had formerly supported him. Chávez was re-elected with 60% of the vote, a larger majority than his 1998 electoral victory. That year, Chávez improved ideological ties with the Cuban government of Fidel Castro by signing an agreement under which Venezuela would supply Cuba with 53,000 barrels of oil per day at preferential rates, in return receiving 20,000 trained Cuban medics and educators. In the ensuing decade, this would be increased to 90,000 barrels a day, in exchange for 40,000 Cuban medics and teachers, dramatically aiding the Caribbean islands' economy and standard of living after its special period of the 1990s. However, Venezuela's growing alliance with Cuba came at the same time as a deteriorating relationship with the United States. Chávez opposed of the 2001 American-led invasion of Afghanistan in response to the September 11 attacks against the U.S. by Islamist militants. In late 2001, Chávez showed pictures on his television show of children said to be killed in a bombing attack. He commented that they are not to blame for the terrorism of Osama bin Laden or anyone else, called on the American government to end the massacre of the innocents, and describing the war as fighting terrorism with terrorism. The U.S. government responded negatively to the comments, which were picked up by the media worldwide and recalled its ambassador for consultations. Meanwhile, the 2000 elections had led to Chávez's supporters gaining 101 out of 165 seats in the Venezuelan National Assembly, and so in November 2001 they voted to allow him to pass 49 social and economic decrees. This move antagonized the opposition movement particularly strongly. At the start of the 21st century, Venezuela was the world's fifth largest exporter of crude oil, with oil accounting for 85% of the country's exports, therefore dominating the country's economy. Before the election of Chávez, the state-run oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. PDVSA, ran autonomously, making oil decisions based on internal guidance to increase profits. Once he came to power, Chávez started directing PDVSA and effectively turned it into a direct government arm whose profits would be injected into social spending. The result of this was the creation of Bolivarian missions, oil-funded social programs targeting poverty, literacy, hunger, and more. In 2001, the government introduced a new hydrocarbons law through which it sought to gain greater state control over the oil industry. The law increased the transnational companies' taxation in oil extraction activities to 30% and set the minimum state participation in mixed companies at 51%, whereby the state-run oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. PDVSA, could have joint control with private companies over industry. By 2006, all of the 32 operating agreements signed with private companies during the 1990s had been converted from being primarily or privately run to being at least 51% controlled by PDVSA. Chávez had also removed many of the managers and executives of PDVSA and replaced them with political allies, stripping the state-owned company expertise. Much of Chávez's opposition originated from the response to the Cubanization of Venezuela. Chávez's popularity dropped due to his relationship with Fidel Castro and Cuba, with Chávez attempting to make Venezuela in Cuba's image. Chávez, following Castro's example, consolidated the country's bicameral legislature into a single national assembly that gave him more power and created community groups of loyal supporters allegedly trained as paramilitaries. Such actions created great fear among Venezuelans who felt like they were tricked and that Chávez had dictatorial goals. The first organized protest against the Bolivarian government occurred in January 2001, when the Chávez administration tried to implement educational reforms through the proposed Resolution 259 and Decree 1.011, which would have seen the publication of textbooks with a heavy Bolivarian bias. Parents noticed that such textbooks were really Cuban books filled with revolutionary propaganda outfitted with different covers. The protest movement, which was primarily by middle-class parents whose children went to privately run schools, marched to central Caracas shouting out the slogan "Con mis hijos no te metas," "Don't mess with my children." Although the protesters were denounced by Chávez, who called them selfish and individualistic, the protest was successful enough for the government to retract the proposed education reforms and instead enter into a consensus-based educational program with the opposition. Later into 2001, an organization known as the Coordinadora Democrática de Acción Cívica, Democratic Coordinator, CD, was founded, under which the Venezuelan opposition political parties, corporate powers, most of the country's media, the Venezuelan Federation of Chambers of Commerce, the Institutional Military Front and the Central Workers Union all united to oppose Chávez's regime. The prominent businessman Pedro Carmona, 1941, was chosen as the CD's leader. The Coordinadora Democrática and other opponents of Chávez's Bolivarian government accused it of trying to turn Venezuela from a democracy into a dictatorship by centralizing power amongst its supporters in the Constituent Assembly and granting Chávez increasingly autocratic powers. Many of them pointed to Chávez's personal friendship with Cuba's Fidel Castro and the one-party socialist government in Cuba as a sign of where the Bolivarian government was taking Venezuela. Chávez sought to make PDVSA his main source of funds for political projects and replaced oil experts with political allies in order to support him with this initiative. In early 2002, he placed a leftist professor as the president of PDVSA. In April 2002, Chávez appointed his allies to head the PDVSA and replaced the company's board of directors with loyalists who had little or no experience in the oil industry, mocking the PDVSA executives on television as he fired them. Anger with Chávez's decisions led to civil unrest in Venezuela, which culminated in an attempted coup. On April 11, 2002, during a march headed to the presidential palace, 19 people were killed, and over 110 were wounded. Chávez believed that the best way to stay in power was to implement Plan Avila. Military officers, including General Raúl Bajual, a founder of Chávez's MBR 200, then decided that they had to pull support from Chávez to deter a massacre, and shortly after at 8 p.m., Vázquez Velasco, together with other ranking army officers, declared that Chávez had lost his support. Chávez agreed to be detained and was transferred by army escort to La Orquilla. Business leader Pedro Carmona declared himself president of an interim government. Carmona abolished the 1999 constitution and appointed a governing committee. Protests in support of Chávez along with insufficient support for Carmona's government quickly led to Carmona's resignation, and Chávez was returned to power on April 14. Chávez's response was to moderate his approach, implementing a new economic team that appeared to be more centrist, and reinstated the old board of directors and managers of the state oil company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. PDVSA, whose replacement had been one of the reasons for the coup. At the same time, the Bolivarian government began to increase the country's military capacity, purchasing 100,000 AK-47 assault rifles and several helicopters from Russia, as well as a number of Super Tucano light attack and training planes from Brazil. Troop numbers were also increased. Chávez faced a 2-month management strike at the PDVSA. The Chávez government's response was to fire about 19,000 striking employees for abandoning their posts and then employing retired workers, foreign contractors, and the military to do their jobs instead. The total firing of tens of thousands of employees by Chávez would forever damage Venezuela's oil industry due to the tremendous loss of expertise. By 2005, the members of Venezuela's energy ministries stated it would take more than 15 years for PDVSA to recover from Chávez's actions. The 1999 constitution had introduced the concept of a recall referendum into Venezuelan politics, so the opposition called for such a referendum to take place. The resulting 2004 referendum to recall Chávez was unsuccessful. 70% of the eligible Venezuelan population turned out to vote, with 59% of voters deciding to keep the president in power. In January 2005, Chávez began openly proclaiming the ideology of socialism of the 21st century, something that was distinct from his earlier forms of Bolivarianism, which had been social democratic in nature, merging elements of capitalism and socialism. He used this new term to contrast the democratic socialism, which he wanted to promote in Latin America, from the Marxist, Leninist socialism that had been spread by socialist states like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China during the 20th century, arguing that the latter had not been truly democratic, suffering from a lack of participatory democracy and an excessively authoritarian governmental structure. In May 2006, Chávez visited Europe in a private capacity, where he announced plans to supply cheap Venezuelan oil to poor working-class communities in the continent. The mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, welcomed him, describing him as the best news out of Latin America in many years. In the presidential election of December 2006, which saw a 77% voter turnout, Chávez was once more elected, this time with 63% of the vote, beating his closest challenger Manuel Rosales. The Organization of American States, OAS, and the Carter Center concluded that the election results were free and legitimate. After this victory, Chávez promised an expansion of the revolution. On December 15, 2006, Chávez publicly announced that those leftist political parties who had continually supported him in the patriotic pole would unite into one single, much larger party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, PSUV. In the speech which he gave announcing the PSUV's creation, Chávez declared that the old parties must forget their own structures, party colors, and slogans, because they are not the most important thing for the fatherland. Chávez had initially proclaimed that those leftist parties which chose to not dissolve into the PSUV would have to leave the government. Party membership rose to 5.7 million people by 2007. The United Nations International Labour Organization expressed concern over some voters being pressured to join the party. On December 28, 2006, President Chávez announced that the government would not renew RCTV's broadcast license, which expired on May 27, 2007, thereby forcing the channel to cease operations on that day. On May 17, 2007, the government rejected a plea made by RCTV to stop the TV station's forced shutdown. Thousands of protesters marching both against and in support of the government's decision remained on the streets in Caracas. Other marches took place in Maracaibo and Valencia. On May 21, 2007, hundreds of journalists and students marched in Caracas carrying a banner reading SOS. Freedom of expression. A few days later, on May 25, 2007, university students from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, the Universidad Simón Bolívar and the Universidad Central de Venezuela protested against the government's intentions. On May 26, tens of thousands of protesters marched in support of RCTV to their headquarters. Since the week prior to the shutdown of RCTV, many individuals, international organizations, and NGOs including the OAS's Secretary-General José Miguel Insulza and its Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, the Inter-American Press Association, Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists have expressed concerns for freedom of the press following the shutdown. However, Secretary Insulza also stated that it was up to the Venezuelan courts to solve this dispute and that he believed that this was an administrative decision. In 2007, the Bolivarian government set up a constitutional commission in order to review the 1999 constitution and suggest potential amendments to be made to it. Led by the prominent pro-Chávez intellectual Luis Brito Garcia, it suggested measures that would have increased many of the president's powers, for instance increasing the presidential term limit to 7 years, allowing the president to run for election indefinitely and centralizing powers in the executive. The government put the suggested changes to a public referendum in December 2007. Abstention rate was high, however, with 44% of registered voters not turning out, and in the end the proposed changes were rejected by 51% of votes. This would prove to the first electoral loss that Chávez had faced in the 13 electoral contests held since he took power, due to the top-down nature of the changes, as well as general public dissatisfaction with the absence of internal debate on its content, as well as dissatisfaction with the running of the social programs, increasing street crime, and with corruption within the government. In mid-2010, tons of rotten food supplies imported during Chávez's government through subsidies of state-owned enterprise PVL were found. Due to the scandal, PVL started being administrated by the Vice President of Venezuela and afterwards by the Alimentation Ministry. 3 former managers were detained, but were released afterwards, and 2 of them had their positions restored. In July 2010, official estimates stated that 130,000 tons of food supplies were affected, while the political opposition informed of 170,000 tons. As of 2012, any advances in the investigations by the National Assembly were unknown. The most accepted explanation of the loss of food supplies is the organization of PVL, because the Food Network allegedly imported supplies faster than what it could distribute them. The opposition considers the affair as a corrupt case, and spokespeople have assured that the public officials deliberately imported more food that could be distributed to embezzle funds through the import of subsidized supplies. In order to ensure that his Bolivarian Revolution became socially ingrained in Venezuela, Chávez discussed his wish to stand for re-election when his term ran out in 2013, and spoke of ruling beyond 2030. 173 Under the 1999 Constitution, he could not legally stand for re-election again, and so brought about a referendum on February 15, 2009 to abolish the 2-term limit for all public offices, including the presidency. Approximately 70% of the Venezuelan electorate voted, and they approved this alteration to the constitution with over 54% in favor, allowing any elected official the chance to try to run indefinitely. On October 7, 2012, Chávez won election as president for a 4th time, his third 6-year term. He defeated Enrique Capriles with 54% of the votes versus 45% for Capriles, which was a lower victory margin than in his previous presidential wins, in the 2012 Venezuelan presidential election. Turnout in the election was 80%, with a hotly contested election between the 2 candidates. There was significant support for Chávez amongst the Venezuelan lower class. Chávez's opposition blamed him for unfairly using state funds to spread largesse before the election to bolster Chávez's support among his primary electoral base, the lower class. The inauguration of Chávez's new term was scheduled for January 10, 2013, but as he was undergoing medical treatment at the time in Cuba, he was not able to return to Venezuela for that date. The National Assembly President Diosdado Cabello proposed to postpone the inauguration, and the Supreme Court decided that, being just another term of the sitting president and not the inauguration of a new one, the formality could be bypassed. The Venezuelan Bishops' Conference opposed the verdict, stating that the constitution must be respected, and the Venezuelan government had not been transparent regarding details about Chávez's health. Acting executive officials produced orders of government signed by Chávez, which were suspected of forgery by some opposition politicians, who claimed that Chávez was too sick to be in control of his faculties. Guillermo Cáceres, recently dismissed from the office of Panamanian ambassador to the Organization of American States, even claimed that Chávez had been brain dead since December 31, 2012. Due to the death of Chávez, Vice President Nicolas Maduro took over the presidential powers and duties for the remainder of Chávez's abbreviated term until presidential elections were held. Venezuela's constitution specifies that the Speaker of the National Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, should assume the interim presidency if a president cannot be sworn in. Maduro remains in power as president as of 2024. Thank you for watching this video.